I remember the exact smell of the air when the Kethvaran fleet broke through the upper atmosphere. That sounds strange, I know. People always want to know what it looked like, the alien warships, the plasma trails cutting across the clouds, the way the sun seemed to dim behind their hulls like someone pulling a curtain. And yeah, all of that was real. All of that happened. But the thing that stuck with me, the thing that I still wake up thinking about sometimes in the middle of the night, was the smell. It smelled like copper and burning ozone, and something else underneath that, something cold. Something that had no business being in breathable air. It was the smell of a place that had never known oxygen getting close to a place that had always breathed it. Like two worlds colliding in your sinuses. I was standing on the roof of my building in Karachi when it started. Third-floor walk-up, crumbling concrete, a water tower that hadn't worked in 6 years. Not exactly an observation deck, but I'd gone up there to get signal for my comm unit, the way I always did when the towers got overloaded, and I was standing there with my arm raised and my eyes on my screen when the sky above me simply split. Not dramatically, not like in the movies. It was quiet, actually. A long, dark seam opened up about 40,000 meters overhead, and from that seam came light. Cold, blue-white light, the kind that doesn't warm anything. And then the shapes came through the seam one by one, enormous and angular, moving with the slow confidence of things that have never had a reason to hurry. Kethvaran warships, 7 of them over the Arabian Sea alone. I stood there with my arm still raised, comm unit still in my hand, and I watched them come through. I think I was laughing. I'm not proud of that, but something in me found it funny, not because it wasn't terrifying. It absolutely was. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my 31 years on this planet. But it was also so massive that my brain couldn't process it as a threat. It processed it as spectacle first. Fear came about 10 seconds later, and when it came hard. I gripped the ledge of the roof until my knuckles turned white. My neighbor Salma came through the roof access door about a minute after that, because she'd heard me make some kind of sound. I don't even remember making it. And she stood next to me and looked up and didn't say anything for a long, long time. Then she said, "Bader, I think we need to go inside." She was 62 years old. She'd survived 3 floods, 2 political collapses, and a cholera outbreak in her neighborhood when she was young. And when she looked up at 7 alien warships hovering over the city she'd lived in her entire life, her first instinct was to go inside, as if that would help. I didn't laugh at her for that. I understood it completely. That's the human thing about catastrophe, I think. When something is so enormous that your mind can't wrap around it, you fall back on the small. You fall back on go inside, drink some water, check on the children, lock the door. We reached for manageable actions because the unmanageable thing was right there overhead and getting bigger by the second. I went inside, I locked the door, I turned on every screen I could find. And I started watching the end of the world, or what I thought would be the end of the world, from my kitchen. The Kethvaran had been known to humanity for exactly 9 years before they declared war. Not known well, mind you. The Galactic Empire, that's what the xenolinguists had translated their governing title as, though apparently the Kethvaran version of it was something closer to the ordered realm of rightful expansion, had made first contact with a human deep space survey vessel called the Perihelion 9 years ago, somewhere out past the Jovian belt. The Perihelion crew had done everything right. They'd transmitted greeting protocols. They'd kept their hands visible, metaphorically speaking. They'd followed the contact manual that Earth's governments had spent 40 years writing and never expected to actually use. The Kethvaran had responded by scanning the perihelion stem to stern, taking extensive notes about human biology and technology, and then transmitting a message back that took the xenolinguists 14 months to fully decode. The rough translation was something like, "Noted, you are cataloged, await the ordered assessment." That was it. That was 9 years of Kethvaran communication with humanity. One sentence, 14 months to decode, and then silence. Our governments had debated endlessly about what the ordered assessment meant. Some said it was a diplomatic process, that the Empire reviewed all new species and then decided how to engage. Some said it was a military evaluation. Some said it was just bureaucratic boilerplate from a civilization that didn't particularly care about us one way or another. That last group turned out to be the most wrong. Because 9 years of silence wasn't indifference, it was study. We found that out later, piece by piece, as we captured Kethvaran data systems and had our xenolinguists tear through them. For 9 years, the Empire had been watching us, quietly, thoroughly. They'd seeded the solar system with passive observation drones so small and so well hidden that our best sensors had never flagged them. They'd watched our wars, and we'd had 2 regional ones in those 9 years, which I'm sure did not help our case. They'd watched our industrial output, our military technology, our population numbers, our political structure. And then they'd run their calculations through whatever passed for strategic analysis in a civilization that spanned 400 star systems. And those calculations had apparently told them that humanity was a manageable problem. A manageable problem. That's how they'd categorized us in their internal documents when we finally read them. Not a threat, not an ally, not an interesting discovery. A manageable problem best addressed through early intervention before the species reached a development threshold that would make them costly to incorporate into the Empire. Costly to incorporate. They were planning to absorb us. Like they'd absorbed 37 other species in the past 600 years. Not necessarily through extermination. The Kethvaran weren't exterminators, or at least they didn't think of themselves that way. Some of the absorbed species still existed under Empire jurisdiction, reduced to client populations on their homeworlds, contributing labor and resources to the ordered realm. Some hadn't survived the process. The assessment, apparently, had calculated that humanity was controllable, that our military technology, while interesting, was too divided between nation-states to mount a coordinated resistance, that our psychological profile, aggressive, territorial, prone to internal conflict, would actually work in the Empire's favor, because humanity would be too busy fighting itself to organize against an external threat. They'd done this 37 times before. They were very good at it. What they hadn't accounted for, what their 9 years of careful observation had somehow completely missed, was what happens to humans when the threat is external. All those wars they'd observed, all that internal conflict, all that aggression and territoriality they'd noted in their assessment. They'd cataloged it as a weakness. They had no concept of how wrong they were. The first Kethvaran transmission to all of Earth's governments came 47 minutes after their fleet entered the atmosphere. I watched it on my kitchen screen, crouched over my kitchen table with a cup of tea I'd made on instinct and then forgotten to drink. Salma was sitting next to me. We'd somehow ended up sitting next to each other without either of us deciding to. She had her prayer beads in her hands, moving slowly. The transmission was visual. The Kethvaran, when they finally showed themselves, were, and I'm telling you this because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after, genuinely terrifying to look at. Not because they were monstrous in the movie sense, not tentacles and teeth and things that go wrong in the dark. They were just wrong in a specific, hard-to-name way. They were tall, about 2.5 meters, give or take, with a bilateral symmetry that was weirdly close to human, and therefore somehow more unsettling than something completely alien would have been. 4 limbs, 2 for locomotion, 2 for manipulation. But the proportions were off, limbs slightly too long, joints that bent in directions that made your brain flinch, a skull structure that was flat and wide rather than rounded. Their skin, if you could call it that, was a deep iridescent gray-blue, and it seemed to shift slightly in the light, like something between scales and the surface of still water. Their eyes were the worst part, completely black. Not dark brown, not deep purple, black, the kind of black that swallows light, and they were large and angled in a way that meant they were always looking at you slightly sideways, even when facing you directly. It was a predator's eyes on a face that was otherwise almost stately. The one who transmitted, we learned later this was a rank called something like Executor of Declaration, a specific political military role in the Empire's hierarchy, stood very still and spoke for approximately 3 minutes in Kethvaran. The translation came in real time, through the xenolinguistic AI systems that Earth had been training on the perihelion data for years. It ran as text on every screen, every public display, every emergency broadcast. The message said, essentially, "You are species catalogued as humanity, Sol III. The ordered realm of rightful expansion has completed its assessment of your kind. You are hereby notified that Sol III and all inhabited territories of your species will be incorporated into the ordered realm under Standard Absorption Protocol 7. You will receive specific instructions within the next 30 cycles of your star. Compliance is expected. Resistance has historically produced outcomes unfavorable to the resisting species. This transmission is final. There will be no negotiation. That was it. No demands, no terms, no opening for discussion. Just a notification the way you'd notify a tenant that their building was under new ownership and their lease would be changing. I remember the way my screen looked showing that translation. The small blue text at the bottom. The Kethvaran executor still standing in the frame, perfectly still, those black eyes looking sideways at nothing. The sound of the city outside my window, sirens starting, someone shouting, a car alarm going off because an impact tremor from one of the ships overhead had triggered it. I remember looking at Salma. She'd stopped moving her prayer beads. She was staring at the screen with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She was a woman who had always had an expression for everything, warmth, worry, laughter, the specific tired dignity of someone who has lived through many hard things. But this expression was new. It was absolutely flat. Then she said very quietly, "They've made a mistake." I looked at her, "What?" "They've made a mistake," she said again. "You don't say things like that to people. You don't talk to people like that." She shook her head. "My grandfather said something. He said the most dangerous thing in the world is a person who has nothing left to lose and has decided they are done being afraid." She looked at the screen. "These things don't know that yet." I didn't say anything. I went back to watching the screen. But I thought about what she said for a long time afterward. The first 48 hours after the transmission were. I want to be careful with how I say this, because the reality was complicated. There was panic, of course there was. In 100 cities across the planet, there was real, physical panic. People running, people stockpiling, governments going into emergency session, the internet collapsing under traffic as 1 billion people tried to process the same information simultaneously. In 17 cities, the panic turned into violence. Not a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it happened. But here's the thing I watched happen in parallel, and this is the part that I think the Kethvaran never modeled, never predicted, couldn't have predicted from 9 years of watching humanity fight itself. The governments talked to each other. Not slowly, not through the usual channels that took weeks and months and treaties with 17 appendices. Within 6 hours of the Kethvaran transmission, the leaders of every major military power on Earth were in communication. Within 18 hours, they were in the same room, physically, virtually, whatever it took. Within 36 hours, there was a framework. Rough, imperfect, full of compromises that everyone hated slightly, which is exactly how you know a real compromise has been made. The Unified Earth Defense Coordination, they called it, UEDC. Governments would retain their own sovereignty and their own chains of command, but operational military decisions would be coordinated through a joint council. Every military on Earth's capabilities, weapons systems, logistics, and intelligence would be pooled and shared. 37 wars and counting, the Empire had done this. 37 species incorporated or destroyed. None of them had managed this, not in 48 hours, probably not ever or not fast enough. I watched the UEDC announcement on my kitchen screen. I watched the faces of leaders who had been enemies for decades sitting in the same frame, making the same statement. There was no warmth between them. There was no sudden magical feeling of human brotherhood that erased every old grievance and historical wound. But they were in the same room, saying the same thing, and the thing they were saying was no. Just that no, not a sophisticated diplomatic response, not a counteroffer, not a negotiation opening. The first official Earth response to the Kethvaran Declaration was a single transmitted word. No. I cried when I heard that. I'm not embarrassed to say it. I sat in my kitchen and I cried, not from fear, not from sadness, but from something I don't have a precise word for in English. In Urdu, maybe himmat, courage, but also more than courage. The stubbornness to stand up when you have every reason not to, when a smarter creature would bow its head and calculate the odds. We calculated the odds too. I want to be honest about that. Our military analysts, our physicists, our engineers, they all ran the numbers. The Kethvaran fleet above us represented firepower that dwarfed anything Earth had. Their technology was centuries ahead of ours in propulsion, in energy weapons, in shielding. The numbers were not favorable. But somewhere in humanity's calculation, the numbers had always included something the Kethvaran hadn't. Something that doesn't show up clean in data. What happens to humans when they're cornered? My name, by the way, is Tariq Mahmoud Ansari. I was a communications technician before all of this. I worked for one of the city's emergency response networks, keeping signal relays operational during floods and power failures. That's how I ended up where I was when things really started. Not a soldier, not a scientist, not a politician. Just a man who knew how to keep signals running, which, as it turned out, mattered more than almost anything else. I'll get to that. But first, I want to tell you about Colonel Reyes. I met Colonel Alina Reyes on the 4th day after the declaration. She came to our relay station, a small building on the outskirts of the city, mostly automated, one of about 60 I maintained in the region, because the UEDC had identified our network as a potential backbone for military communication in the Arabian Sea sector. She arrived in a dusty transport vehicle with 4 soldiers and a technical sergeant named Akafar, who immediately started asking me questions I didn't know how to answer about encryption protocols and signal redundancy. Reyes herself didn't ask questions right away. She walked through the station looking at things. She was maybe 45, dark-haired, slight in a way that made you underestimate her until she looked at you. When she looked at you, you stopped underestimating her. Her eyes were, I don't know how else to say this, occupied. Like there was a full city behind them and it was working at full capacity all the time. She'd been with the UEDC since the 3rd day. She was a communications warfare specialist, not signals intelligence in the traditional sense, but something more specific. She understood how systems broke, how to break them deliberately, how to exploit the breaks, how to build things that could survive being broken and keep functioning. After she'd walked the station, she came and found me standing by the main console, pretending to look busy. You maintained this network through the 22 floods, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. How? I thought about it. Tape and coffee, I said, and knowing which things you can turn off without losing the things that matter. She almost smiled. That's exactly what I need, she said, someone who knows what can be cut. That conversation lasted about 3 hours. By the end of it, I had a temporary UEDC clearance, a rank equivalent of technical specialist, and a role that I still can't completely explain except to say that I spent the next 8 months keeping human signals alive in ways the Kethvaran couldn't track or jam. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Kethvaran gave us 30 cycles, 30 days, to comply. That was the term in their transmission. Compliance was expected. They did not, apparently, consider it necessary to do anything in those 30 days to enforce the deadline. Why would they? In 37 previous incorporations, the deadline had been a formality. The species being absorbed either went through the formal process of surrender or they mounted token resistance that was overwhelmed within days, and then they surrendered. The 30 days was bureaucratic procedure more than tactical calculation. They maintained their fleet positions, 7 ships over the Arabian Sea, similar deployments over every major ocean above major population centers, just present, just there hanging in the sky like a reminder. A few smaller vessels, what we'd come to call picket ships, moved in lower orbits, scanning. Occasionally one would descend to about 15,000 meters and hold position for a few hours, then rise again. We never fully figured out what those descents were for. Some kind of localized scanning, maybe, or just demonstration. We can come lower if we want. They didn't attack. They didn't disrupt our infrastructure. They didn't even jam our communications, which was something we'd expected. They just waited. Patient and absolute, the way something waits when it has no concept of the thing it's waiting for saying no. And we used every minute of those 30 days. I've read accounts since then, military histories, official analyses, that try to make those 30 days sound organized and strategic, like we executed some brilliant plan with clear phases and deliberate milestones. That's not quite how it felt from inside. From inside, it felt like organized chaos barely held together by collective terror, and the stubbornness of people who refused to go down quietly. But certain things happened that I can tell you about because I was there for some of them, or because people I trust were there, and told me. The physics community moved first. I don't mean they were faster than the military. The military was running on adrenaline and logistics from the first hour. But the theoretical physics community made the first move that actually changed what was possible. On day 3, a team at the CERN facility, mostly people who'd been working on propulsion theory for 20 years, treating it like a pure research problem with no practical application in their lifetimes, released an internal memo that was shared across the UEDC science network. The subject line was simply, "We think we've been doing this wrong." The memo was 40 pages of dense mathematics that I couldn't read, but the people who could read it apparently went very quiet and then got very loud. The short version, as explained to me later by Dr. Yuki Sato, a propulsion physicist who became part of our regional coordination network, was this. Humanity had been approaching faster-than-light propulsion, based on models derived from our own observation of physics. We'd been working with what we could see and measure, but the Kethvaran ships, which had traveled between stars and arrived in our system, represented observable data points that contradicted our models in specific, interesting ways. The team at CERN had been quietly analyzing the perihelion data for 9 years, and they'd found a gap. A place where Kethvaran drive signatures didn't match what human theory predicted they should look like. That gap suggested something about the underlying geometry of how the Empire's drives actually worked. And if that geometry was what the memo suggested, there was a different approach, one that human physics had been circling around for decades without committing to, because it was counterintuitive and the math was brutal. "The point," Yuki told me later, sitting in the back of a relay station with tea going cold between us, "is not that we built better ships in 30 days. We couldn't. But we understood something about how theirs worked. And understanding that meant we knew something about how they might fail." I asked her what she meant. She smiled and didn't answer directly. She had that habit. "You know what happens," she said instead, "when you design a very sophisticated lock and then you encounter a door that doesn't have hinges." I thought about it. "The lock is useless," I said. "The lock is worse than useless," she said. "Because you designed the lock, you know exactly how it works, and the person on the other side of the door has never seen a lock before in their life. They don't know what you're trying to keep them out of. They just know the door isn't locked." She drank her tea. "That's approximately the situation," she said. On day 7, the UEDC made a second transmission to the Kethvaran. Not to negotiate. The first no had been categorical and they'd held to it. This transmission was different. It was a question. Single word again. "Why?" We didn't expect an answer. We sent it because, and this was a communications strategy decision made by people much smarter than me, but explained to me later, we wanted to see how the Kethvaran communicated when they weren't declaring. We wanted to see if they could communicate in any other register, whether they had a mode for dialogue. They responded in 6 hours, faster than anyone expected. The executor appeared again, same stillness, same sideways black eyes, and this time the message was longer, almost 8 minutes. When the translation came through, it was essentially a recitation. The Empire's history of expansion, presented as justification. The 37 incorporations, presented as evidence that the process worked, that absorbed species ultimately functioned within the ordered realm, that resistance was an inefficiency in a process that was fundamentally beneficial. "You will be better within the ordered realm than outside it," was the closest the translation came to a direct statement of their reasoning. "The assessment has determined that your species, while aggressive, is manageable. Other aggressive species have been successfully incorporated and function adequately. Your integration will proceed according to standard protocol." Adequately, function adequately. That word choice made its way around the world in about 40 minutes. Someone put it on a screen in Nairobi, and someone photographed it, and it went everywhere. Just that word, in big letters, displayed over a crowd. Adequately. I can't explain precisely why that word did what it did. Maybe because it was so small. Maybe because after everything, the ships in the sky, the 30-day deadline, the fear and the chaos, the worst thing they said about us was that we would function adequately. Not be destroyed, not be enslaved in the brutal sense. Just adequate, good enough. A managed species, contained and functional, no longer particularly relevant to our own story. Something happened to human morale after that word. Something specific and chemical almost. You could feel it shift. The Kethvaran had made another mistake. Not the first, not the last, but this one was important. They had answered. They had explained themselves, and in explaining themselves, they had handed humanity something it needed more than anything else at that moment. A reason to be furious. Not afraid, furious. Anger is a much better fuel than fear. Any human could have told them that, but they hadn't asked any humans. I need to tell you about what happened on day 12, because day 12 was when I understood, really understood, not intellectually but in my bones, that something had shifted. I was at the relay station, running signal tests with Sergeant Akaffer and a young local technician named Anwar who joined us 3 days earlier because he had nowhere else to be in good hands for the work. It was late. The kind of late where the dark outside feels like a substance rather than just an absence of light. And there's that particular quiet in the city where only the nighttime sounds are left, dogs, a distant generator, someone playing music low somewhere. I stepped outside to check the equipment on the building's roof. A habit, mostly, checking connections that were fine, and I looked up. The Kethvaran ship was still there, the same one that had been hovering at altitude over the Arabian Sea since day one. You couldn't see it in detail from the ground, just a shape, enormous and dark, blotting out stars. But I noticed something different. A light on its underside. It had always had running lights, pale blue, regular intervals, but this was a different light. Amber, pulsing, slow, and irregular, not a running light, something else. I watched it for a while. Then I went back inside and mentioned it to Akaffer. He looked at me for a long moment, then he picked up his comm and made a call. Within 20 minutes, I was on a scrambled line with someone at UEDC Central Coordination who I never learned the name of. The voice was calm, professional, and it said, "Yes. We see it, we don't know what it is yet. Keep watching and report any changes." 3 hours later, the amber light stopped. We found out 6 weeks later what it had been. I'll get there. But I remember standing on that roof looking up at that impossible dark shape in the sky with its wrong amber light, and feeling something I can only describe as recognition. Like the universe was showing me something important, and I was almost understanding it. Day 17. This is the one the histories talk about most. This is the one that changed everything. Dr. Amara Nwasu was 58 years old, and she had spent her career studying something called adaptive systems failure. The way complex systems, the ones that are very good at doing a specific thing, break in specific ways when they encounter conditions they weren't designed for. She'd applied it to infrastructure, to ecological systems, to economic models. She had a particular way of thinking about resilience that was, I've read her work since, trying to understand what she saw that others didn't, genuinely different from how most people approach problems. Her contribution to the 30-day effort was not weapons development. She never touched a weapons system. What she did was put together a 70-page analysis of Kethvaran adaptive capacity based on everything we knew about them. The 9 years of observation data, the 2 transmissions, the observable behavior of their fleet in the days since arrival. The analysis argued, with considerable mathematical support, that the Kethvaran had an adaptive problem. Not a weakness in the conventional sense, not a vulnerability in their weapons or their shields or their propulsion, something deeper. A pattern in how they thought about problems. 37 incorporations over 600 years, all successful, a perfect record. And Dr. Nwasu's analysis said that perfect record is the vulnerability. She called it success calcification. The idea that an organization, any species, any system that has succeeded consistently and completely for a long time develops a kind of rigidity around its successful methods. Not conscious rigidity, not laziness. Something structural. The methods that work get encoded into everything, strategy, culture, training, decision architecture. They become so fundamental that they stop being choices and start being assumptions. The Kethvaran had been incorporating species for 600 years. They had a process. The process worked. The process had always worked. And so the process had stopped being something they did and had become something they were. What Dr. Nwasu argued was that this meant they were constitutionally incapable of encountering a genuinely novel situation and recognizing it as novel in time to adapt appropriately. Their history was too successful. They'd never failed, and you can't learn to fail and recover if you've never failed. What she recommended, and this was the part that got her in front of the UEDC Joint Council within 48 hours, was not trying to defeat the Kethvaran militarily in the first engagement. That was almost certainly impossible with our technology and their firepower. Instead, confuse them, disrupt their model, do things that didn't fit their pattern, force them into adaptive territory they had no experience navigating. They expect resistance, she told the council, according to the official transcript I read later. All 37 species resisted in various ways. None of them succeeded, but they resisted. The Kethvaran have modeled resistance. They know what it looks like. They know how to process it. What they have never encountered is something that doesn't fit their model of resistance at all. One of the council members, I think it was the American Defense Secretary, asked her, "What does that look like in practice?" "Chaos that looks like order," she said, "and order that looks like chaos, simultaneously, and anything else that doesn't fit the 37 case profiles they're working from." "How specific can you be?" "I can give you a list of 17 things to try," she said. "I have no idea which ones will work. That's actually the point." They tried all 17 things. Over the next 12 days of the 30-day window, while preparing the actual military response, they tried all 17 of Dr. Nwasu's recommended confusions. I'll tell you about the ones I either witnessed or heard about directly. The first one, music. On day 18, at exactly the same moment, speakers set up in cities on every continent, publicly, openly, not hidden, began broadcasting music. Not any single piece of music which might have been comprehensible as a signal. Every city broadcast something different. Different frequencies, different cultural traditions, different instruments, different tempos. Lagos played drumming. Seoul played orchestral. Rio played something dense and electronic. Karachi, which was where I was, played the combined sound of about 40 different open-air performances happening simultaneously, recorded and broadcast through the city's emergency alert system. It was beautiful, and it was insane, and it was entirely deliberately incoherent. The Kethvaran, monitoring every signal humanity put out, spent considerable processing resources trying to decode it. We know this because one of their data systems, captured much later, showed analysis logs from that day running for hours. They were treating it as encoded communication, looking for patterns in what was pattern designed to look like it might have patterns. There were none, it was just us being us. The analysis logs showed they eventually flagged it as possible psychological preparation, ritual purpose unclear. Which was, well, it wasn't wrong exactly. The second confusion I'll tell you about was silence. On day 20, for a period of 4 hours, every electronic signal on Earth stopped. Everything that could be turned off was turned off. Communications, radar, civilian broadcasts, everything. The planet went dark on every spectrum simultaneously. The Kethvaran, who had been monitoring our signals continuously, encountered a complete absence of data. Complete silence from a planet with 8 billion inhabitants. Their analysis logs, again, read later, were remarkable. The absence, apparently, was more alarming to them than anything we had transmitted. Source silence, cause undetermined, was the entry. And then, possibility of coordinated technological failure. And then, the one that I found most interesting, possibility of coordinated concealment. They didn't know what to do with it. They moved 2 of their picket ships into lower orbits to get better sensor readings. They transmitted a ping, an active scan pulse, that I'm sure they'd never transmitted at a target planet before. They were reacting. They were uncertain. 4 hours and 1 minute after the silence started, everything came back on at once. All of it simultaneously, a massive burst of signal from an entire planet turning on like a switch. The analysis log entry for that moment, signal restoration, cause undetermined. Pattern does not match any prior species behavior profile, flagging for senior assessment. They flagged us for senior review. On their side, that apparently meant additional decision-making layers would be involved in any response choices. It slowed them down. That was the point. The third thing was the one that I was most directly involved in. On day 22, Colonel Reyes came to the relay station at 3 in the morning. I was awake, most of us weren't sleeping much those days, sitting with Anwar and running routing tests when her transport pulled up outside. She came in with Sergeant Akaffer and a civilian I hadn't met before, a woman named Priya who turned out to be a xenolinguistics specialist from the UEDC Technical Division. Reyes sat down across from me and put a data chip on the table. "I need to know something about your network," she said. "Can you route a signal to look like it's coming from inside one of those ships?" I stared at her. I know it sounds impossible, she said. It sounds more than impossible, I said. Their ships aren't using any transmission technology I have equipment for. We're not trying to actually enter their systems, Priya said, leaning forward. She had the focused energy of someone who'd been working a problem for 72 hours straight and had found something. We want to generate a signal that appears to their external sensors to be originating from inside one of their vessels. A signal that looks, from the outside, like internal communication that shouldn't be happening. I thought about it. You want them to think someone is talking inside one of their ships when no one should be. We want them to think something is wrong with one of their ships in a way that doesn't have an obvious external cause, Reyes said. Something that makes them look inward instead of outward, something that makes them worry about themselves. I sat with that for a moment, then I asked, what would that signal look like in their own encoding? Priya slid the data chip closer to me. We've been building a library of their signal patterns since day one. Everything we've captured from their transmissions, from the picket ship's scan pulses, from their navigation emissions. We think we have enough to generate something that looks authentic, but we need to get it close enough and distribute it in the right way that it mimics an internal source. I looked at the chip. I need to think about this, I said. You have 4 hours, Reyes said. Then we're out of time on this particular window. I spent those 4 hours thinking and testing and talking with Anwar, who turned out to have a genuinely strange and useful mind for signal routing problems. He was 23 years old, had studied electrical engineering for 2 years before dropping out, and he thought about signals the way some people think about traffic flow, not as data but as movement, as things wanting to go certain ways and being redirected. What we came up with was not, to be honest, technically sophisticated. It was like misdirection. The way a magician makes you look at one hand while the other one does the thing. We couldn't fake a Kethvaran signal. We didn't have the equipment and we didn't fully understand their encoding. But we could create a physical situation that would cause their own emissions to bounce and refract in a pattern that looked, to an external sensor, like there was a source inside the ship that wasn't supposed to be there. The details are complicated and I'm not sure I can explain them well anyway. The key insight, this was Anwar's, not mine, and I told him so afterward and he went red and looked at his feet, was that we didn't need to create the signal. We just needed to create the conditions that would cause it to appear. We used the relay network, all 60 stations in the region, running in a specific coordinated sequence, bouncing signals off the Kethvaran ship's hull in a pattern that would cause the hull's own natural emission signature to create a feedback artifact. A ghost signal. Something that looked internal but wasn't. We ran it for 11 minutes. I don't know exactly what effect it had on the ship above us. I wasn't in a position to see their sensor readings or their internal communications. But I know what happened 40 minutes later because Reyes told me. The ship, which had been stationary for 22 days, moved. Not far. A lateral adjustment about 2 kilometers, but it moved. They repositioned, Reyes said. They thought they had an internal systems problem, and they repositioned to run diagnostics. Is that good? I asked. They took one of their main guns off angle, she said, for the duration of their diagnostic window. I thought about what that meant. Oh, I said. Yeah, she said. It wasn't the end of anything. It wasn't a decisive blow. But it was like learning that the thing you thought was impossible to move could actually be made to flinch. Once you know that, everything is different. Day 29, 1 day before the deadline. The Kethvaran transmitted again. This time the executor was different. Not different physically, I couldn't tell them apart by appearance, but the transmission had a different quality. Less absolute. The stillness was the same, but something in the framing of the words, when the translation came through, carried a quality that our xenolinguists, reading it in real time, flagged immediately. They're uncertain, the analysis note said, running alongside the translation on the screens. Uncertain might be too strong, they flagged it as something more like, accounting for additional complexity. The message itself said, "This is a reminder that your compliance deadline completes in 1 planetary rotation. Compliance is still the expected outcome. The ordered realm remains prepared to proceed with Standard Protocol 7. Any resistance will be addressed through graduated response measures." Graduated response measures. That phrase hadn't been in the first message. The first message had simply said resistance produced historically unfavorable outcomes. This message specified a graduated response, which meant steps, which meant they weren't planning to simply obliterate us. Our analysis team read that as a significant data point. The Kethvaran, at some level, whatever had been discussed in their senior assessment, whatever the 30 days of confusion had produced in their calculations, were not entirely sure how to proceed. The graduated response framing suggested they were keeping options open, giving themselves room to maneuver. An empire that had absorbed 37 species without hesitation was suddenly, for the first time, leaving itself room to maneuver. Dr. Nwasu, when she was told about the phrasing, apparently said, "Good. They're thinking they shouldn't have been thinking. Now we make them think harder." Day 30. I'm going to tell you what I know. Some of this I witnessed. Some of it I've pieced together from accounts and records. I'll try to be clear about which is which. What I witnessed, I was at the relay station at 600. Reyes was there, Akafar, Anwar, 3 other technicians whose names I'll leave out because not all of them have chosen to be public about their involvement. The station was running at full capacity, all 60 network nodes active, running the distributed routing pattern we'd refined over the past 8 days. At exactly 700, we'd coordinated on this, every relay network in every theater simultaneously. We ran the ghost signal protocol, not just us. Simultaneously, as coordinated as we could manage, every single theater of operations ran a version of the disruption protocols we'd developed over the previous 12 days. The music, the silence, the ghost signals, all of it and 6 other things I haven't described, all at once, all global. The Kethvaran, monitoring a planet that was supposed to either comply or begin recognizable resistance, got everything that wasn't recognizable compliance and wasn't recognizable resistance, all at once, globally coordinated. What happened next? I watched it on the sensor feeds that Reyes had running on her display, because our network was feeding data to the UEDC Tactical Center in real time. All 7 ships above the Arabian Sea moved. Not toward cities, not into attack positions. They pulled back, up, 20 kilometers, 30, then 50. The same thing was happening over every deployment zone on Earth, simultaneously. The Kethvaran fleet, for the first time in 600 years of expansion, pulled back. The second transmission from the Empire that day came at 1340. The executor was different again, and this time the translation team was very sure something in the formality structure of the message was different. The specific register used in the message indicated a speaker addressing something they had classified internally as requiring reevaluation. Not defeat, but reevaluation. The message said, "The ordered realm has determined that additional assessment of species humanity Sol III is required prior to proceeding with standard protocol. A pause period is declared. During this period, no action will be taken by either party. Communication will be established through formal channels. A delegate of the ordered realm will be designated for this process." Communication, formal channels, a delegate. They were asking to talk. I sat in the relay station and listened to Reyes read out the translation, and I didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Then Akafar, who was a quiet man with a calm face and the kind of controlled professional demeanor that military culture produces in the people who are genuinely good at what they do. Akafar made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and an exhale, and then he put his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Anwar looked at me. He was young enough that he'd processed the whole 30 days differently than the rest of us, with a kind of focused intensity that probably came from not having enough life experience to fully comprehend what he might be losing. Now, with the tension gone from the room, he looked young. He looked like a 23-year-old who just realized what 30 days had meant. "We did it," he said. "It wasn't quite a statement. It wasn't quite a question." I thought about how to answer that. "We bought time," I said. "That's what we did, we bought time." "Is that enough?" "It's everything," I said. "Time is everything." The Kethvaran pulled their fleet to high orbit that evening. The ships were still there, they didn't leave, and they didn't pretend the situation was resolved. But they went to high orbit, above the atmosphere, and the sky got its color back. Just light again, normal light, the kind that doesn't make you feel like you're standing in something that wants to swallow you. I went up to the roof of the relay station that evening, just to look at the sky without a ship in it. The city sounded different, not the way it sounds during celebrations. There were celebrations happening in parts of the city. I could hear them distantly, but the quiet parts of the city sounded different too. Like the air itself had relaxed, like the particular tension that had been in every sound for 30 days had finally let go. Salma called me. She'd been staying with her daughter's family since day 3 because her daughter had insisted, and Salma, for once, had agreed without arguing. "They're talking to us now," she said. Her voice was controlled, but underneath it was something I recognized from knowing her for years. Something that was working hard to stay controlled. "They're talking to us," I confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. "I told you," she said finally. "I told you they made a mistake." "You told me," I said. "They should have asked us," she said. "Before they did any of this, they should have asked someone from here what happens when you talk to people like that. Any one of us could have told them." I didn't have anything to add to that. She was right, in the particular way that people are right when they understand something about human nature that can't be derived from data. The negotiations took 14 months. I was not part of them. My clearance didn't extend that far and my skills were the wrong kind. Ray's was part of them, I know that much. Dr. Nwasu was central to the human delegation's preparation, though she was not a negotiator herself. Dr. Sato's propulsion work and what it had told us about Kethvaran drive physics turned out to be a significant piece of leverage, not because we'd used it against them, but because they discovered during the negotiations that we could have. And that calculation changed theirs. The outcome of the negotiations was not what either side wanted. The Empire did not get Standard Protocol 7. No incorporation, no absorbed species, no adequate function under the ordered realm. Humanity did not get the Empire to leave and never come back. They were still out there. 400 star systems and 600 years of expansion did not disappear. What the negotiations produced was something that had apparently never happened in the Empire's history. A formal recognition of sovereign status for a species outside the ordered realm. A framework for coexistence and eventually, the diplomats hoped, exchange. Not absorption, not war, something else. Something the Empire had apparently never needed a word for before and had to construct the concept from components. The Kethvaran word they eventually used for it, translated as close as possible, meant something like, the exception that caused new understanding. I thought about that phrase for a long time. The exception that caused new understanding. That's not how they'd planned to think of us. We were supposed to be entry 38 in a 600-year ledger. Something categorized, processed, incorporated, managed. Instead, we were the exception. Because of tape and coffee and knowing what you can turn off without losing what matters. Because of Anwar's strange mind for signal routing and Yuki's understanding of what they were doing wrong. Because of Dr. Nwasu's insight about the danger of never having failed. Because of Ray's asking exactly the right question in the middle of the night. Because of a woman with prayer beads looking up at a ship in the sky and saying they made a mistake without flinching. Because when you back humans into a corner, we don't simplify. We get complicated. We get creative and stubborn and furious, and we reach for everything we know. And we know things about surviving that 600 years of easy success had never taught the Kethvaran to fear. I went back to maintaining relay networks after the fleet withdrew to high orbit. The work was the same. Signal tests, equipment checks, routing problems, the specific boredom of infrastructure work that only matters when it fails. Anwar stayed on with me for a while, then went back to his engineering program, then changed his field to something I didn't entirely follow, but that Ray's later told me was relevant to the ongoing technical exchange program that emerged from the negotiations. The city rebuilt its normal sounds, slower than you'd think that process. You'd expect relief to rush back in and fill all the spaces that fear had emptied, but it doesn't work that way. People who have been tightly wounded for a long time take time to unwind. You'd hear the calls to prayer in the morning, and for the first few months there was a quality to them that was different, more weighted somehow. Like the words meant something additional that they hadn't meant before. I don't say that wrong things had been made right. The negotiations had produced a framework, not a peace. The Kethvaran were still there. 400 systems of them, patient in the way that very old and very powerful things are patient. The exception had caused new understanding, but understanding is not the same as friendship, and it is not the same as safety. What we had was time. What we'd always had was time when we chose to use it. Time to think, to build, to get better at the things we already knew how to do and learn the things we didn't. That was what 30 days had bought us, not victory, not security, but time with the door still open. I want to tell you something that I don't see in the official accounts. About 2 years after the declaration, I was at a UEDC technical conference, one of the lower-level ones, working groups, the kind where the people in the room are technicians and engineers rather than diplomats and generals. During one of the breaks, I got talking with a xenolinguist who'd been part of the negotiation support team. She'd spent 14 months in the room, or adjacent to the room, and she'd processed more Kethvaran communication than almost anyone alive. I asked her because I'd always wanted to know, what did they actually think of us? Not the official diplomatic posture, not the recognition language, not the public statement from the executor. What did the Kethvaran actually think? She considered it for a while. She had the careful verbal habits of someone who works with precision in language for a living. There's no direct translation for it, she said finally. But there's a word they started using in internal communications about 2 weeks into the negotiations, when they referred to humanity. They stopped using the catalog entry, species sol III, manageable problem, and they started using this other word. What does it mean? She almost smiled. The closest I can get is something like, the ones who shouldn't work but do. I sat with that. The ones who shouldn't work but do. Coming from a civilization that ran on order, on assessment, on the clean logic of a system that had functioned perfectly for 6 centuries. That felt, in its strange sideways way, like something close to respect. We were the exception that caused new understanding. We were the ones who shouldn't work. But we did. That's the human thing about it, I think. That's the part that can't be cataloged or assessed or fitted into a pattern from 37 previous cases. We're not supposed to hold together under pressure, not with our history, our divisions, our centuries of fighting each other over every imaginable thing. We're not supposed to coordinate in 48 hours and outthink a 600-year empire with tape and coffee and an old woman's stubbornness. We're not supposed to work. But here we are. The fleet stayed in high orbit for 11 months after the negotiations concluded, as the formal recognition process was ratified through Empire bureaucracy. Then they withdrew to the edge of the system. A permanent observer vessel, much smaller, no weapons, just sensors and a communications team, remained. It's still there. I think about it sometimes when I go up on the roof at night. Somewhere past Jupiter, past the orbit of Saturn, there's a Kethvaran ship watching us, making notes, updating whatever passes for their understanding of humanity. I hope we keep surprising them. I think we will. People forget about Yusuf Ademi. That bothers me. Not because the other names don't deserve their place in the histories, they do, but because Yusuf was the one who did the thing that I think actually changed the calculus on the Kethvaran side in a way that none of the strategic confusions quite managed. And he did it alone, without authorization, with 26 minutes of preparation and a broken leg. I'll get to that. But first, month 2. The ceasefire, it wasn't called that officially, but that's what it was 3 weeks old when the Kethvaran made their first move under the new framework. They sent a delegate. Not a ship, a delegate. One individual, in a shuttle the size of a city bus, landing at a designated site in the Atacama Desert in Chile, which had been selected because it was remote, flat, and had very little infrastructure that could be damaged if things went wrong. The UEDC had cleared a radius of 40 kilometers around the landing zone and put 2,000 soldiers at the perimeter. The delegate's name, transliterated, was something like Kethvaran Vorithas Kelsamari. We called them Vor. That wasn't their preference as far as we could tell, but they didn't object to it, and human diplomatic staff had decided that having a workable shortened name for a regular point of contact was worth the cultural awkwardness. Vor was not the executor who delivered the declaration. They were what the Kethvaran classified as an assessment revision officer, which the xenolinguists translated more colloquially as the closest thing the Empire had to a diplomat when they encountered something that didn't fit the standard protocol. In 600 years, apparently, Vor's role had rarely been needed. The standard protocol almost always worked. Almost. Vor landed in the Atacama on a Tuesday morning local time, in a vessel that settled onto the flat desert ground with exactly the kind of quiet confidence that made you suddenly, acutely aware of how loud human technology is by comparison. The shuttle had no exhaust, no vibration that reached the perimeter. It landed like it was setting down on its own terms, and those terms didn't include making a sound about it. The delegation that went to meet Vor was 9 people. A team lead, former Ambassador Helois Vanderbilt, 63 years old, who had spent 4 decades navigating some of the most intractable human diplomatic situations on record, and had been the first human to read the full Kethvaran assessment data when it was captured. A security lead, Major Quaim Assant, whose job was to communicate protective authority without communicating threat, which is one of the genuinely hardest things to do in any setting. A xenolinguistics team of 3, 2 technical specialists, and 2 observers, one a scientist, one a journalist, for reasons of transparency that the UEDC Council had felt strongly about. The journalist was Yusuf Ademi. Yusuf was 41, Nigerian-British, based in Lagos for the past decade. He'd covered 3 wars, 2 humanitarian crises, and the messy political collapse of a government that had been supposed to be stable. He had the particular quality that good journalists develop, or maybe are born with: the ability to be present in extreme situations without being consumed by them. To watch and understand and translate in real time events that most people would need years to process. He'd applied for the observer role through the UEDC Press Coordination Office along with approximately 14,000 other journalists. He'd been selected, the council later told me, because his application had included a note that said, "I would like to observe, not report on this event. Reporting can come later. For this, I want to be present." That distinction, observe, not report, had apparently struck the selection committee as exactly right. Yusuf walked into the Atacama on a Tuesday morning with a broken leg. Not badly broken. A stress fracture, actually, from an old injury that had flared up during the crisis months. He'd been moving too fast, in too many wrong places, and his body had registered objection in the form of a hairline fracture in his tibia that he hadn't had time or inclination to properly treat. He was wearing a compression support and walking with a slight, careful quality that you'd notice if you were looking for it and miss if you weren't. He didn't mention it to anyone. He didn't list it as a concern. He filed his medical disclosure and then set it aside and walked out into the desert when the delegation walked. I know about the leg because he told me later, over food in a Nairobi restaurant 2 years after the Atacama meeting. He told me because we'd gotten to talking about the moment that I want to tell you about, and he said the leg was part of it, in a way. The meeting in the Atacama lasted 4 hours. I wasn't there. I watched the partial feed that the UEDC released, about 20 minutes of footage, carefully selected, showing the initial approach and first contact without any of the substantive dialogue, which was classified. I've pieced together a more complete picture from Yusuf's account, from Vanderbilt's memoir, and from the declassified records that were released 3 years later. What I can tell you is this. Vor emerged from the shuttle and stood in the desert and looked at the 9 humans for a long time before doing anything else. The Kethvaran way of observing, those wide, angled black eyes, taking in everything sideways, was something the delegation had been briefed on extensively. None of that preparation quite made it easier in person, by all accounts. Standing in flat desert light being looked at by something that intelligent and that alien, that had the practical capability to end your civilization, and had recently been planning to, that's not something briefings fully prepare you for. The delegation held its ground. Vanderbilt, at the front, maintained eye contact with Vor in a way that the xenolinguistics team had advised, not dominant, not deferential, simply present. The Kethvaran read a lot into how a species managed eye contact, apparently. Vor spoke first. The translation came through earpieces that the delegation wore, a half-second delay that Vanderbilt later described as disorienting in a way I never fully adjusted to. What Vor said in opening was, "You are the ones who chose the exception." It was a statement, not a question, but Vanderbilt treated it like a question. "We made the choice we had available to us," she said. "All species make the choices available to them," Vor said. "The exception is that your choices were not the ones the assessment predicted." "What did the assessment predict?" 31% probability of organized resistance within the compliance window, Vor said. 7% probability of resistance that required tactical response. Less than 1% probability of communication disruption requiring senior assessment review. And what probability did you assign to what actually happened? There was a pause, long enough that the xenolinguists in the delegation exchanged looks. It was not within the probability range that was modeled, Vor said. That is why I am here. The 4 hours of talks covered a lot of ground that I won't be able to relay accurately, because it was far above my classification level, and the declassified summaries strip out most of the texture. But the moment I want to tell you about happened in the 3rd hour. Vor had asked a question that the xenolinguistics team would later spend months analyzing. They'd been talking about the 30-day window, the chaos protocols, the silence, the music, all of it, and Vor had asked Vanderbilt, with what the team read as genuine inquiry rather than challenge. Why did you not use that time to prepare military response instead of these actions? It was a good question. The honest answer was that preparing military response would have been pointless against the Kethvaren's firepower, and the confusion protocols had been tactically superior to conventional resistance. But Vanderbilt gave a different answer. Not wrong, but different in emphasis. She said, we were not only preparing to fight, we were reminding ourselves who we are. Vor was quiet for a moment. Explain. When we played the music and went silent and did the other things, we weren't just trying to confuse your assessment, Vanderbilt said. We were telling ourselves a story about what we are, about what we do under pressure. We are a species that plays music when things are terrible. That is who we are. That matters to us. Vor processed this. The actions had internal purpose as well as external purpose. Almost everything we do has both, Vanderbilt said. Another long pause. This is not a feature of species behavior that the standard protocol models, Vor said. I know, said Vanderbilt. Most of what we do isn't. The moment with Yusuf happened 30 minutes later. The delegation had taken a break. Humans need breaks, a fact that had been communicated to Vor in advance and accepted without comment. They stepped back from the formal exchange and moved to a shaded area where water and food had been set up. Vor did not retreat to their shuttle. They stood where they were in the full desert sun with perfect stillness. Yusuf, during the break, was standing a little apart from the main group. His leg was giving him trouble. 4 hours of standing on flat, hard-packed desert was not what his tibia wanted, and he'd shifted his weight to try to manage it, leaning slightly against a supply crate. He was looking at Vor. And Vor was looking at him. This wasn't unusual. Vor looked at everyone. But there was something specific in it this time, something that Yusuf, who had spent years watching people in tense situations and reading what eyes communicated, noticed. He said later that he couldn't exactly name what he saw, but it was the closest thing to curiosity he'd observed in those wide black eyes, not the categorizing observation that Vor had applied to everything else, something less clinical. Yusuf didn't think about it too long. He just did what his instincts told him to do. He lifted his hand, not in a wave, just raised it. A human gesture that means I see you or I acknowledge you or just hello, the smallest possible social signal. Vor was still. Yusuf lowered his hand. Then Vor raised one of their upper limbs, an exact mirror of what Yusuf had done, not a Kethvaran gesture, not something from their cultural communication library. A mirror, a copy, a response. The delegation, when they noticed, went very quiet. Yusuf said he didn't think about it strategically. He didn't process it as a diplomatic breakthrough or a tactical moment. He just felt instinctively that something had happened, some small crossing, the tiniest bridge. He smiled at Vor. He couldn't help it. It was a reflex. Vor's face didn't change. The Kethvaran had no muscle structure for the human expression of smiling. But something in the set of those wide black eyes shifted, a quality of attention, like a focus changing. When the formal talks resumed, the xenolinguistics team noticed that Vor's communication register had changed slightly. A small thing, easily missed, but the register used for addressing someone whose category had been elevated. In Kethvaran diplomatic hierarchy, it meant someone who is recognized as more than initially assessed. 26 minutes of break, a raised hand and a smile. That was Yusuf Ademi. He told me about his leg because I'd asked him during our dinner in Nairobi. what he remembered most from that day. I'd expected him to talk about Vor's gesture, or the change in the negotiation register, or the things Vanderbilt had said. Instead, he told me about his leg. "I kept thinking," he said, "that if I let myself limp, it would change the way they saw us. Not deliberately, I don't think they would have decided anything based on whether I was limping. But I would have been thinking about my leg instead of being present. And being present was the job." "Did the leg hurt?" "Tremendously," he said. He was laughing a little. "But you know what's interesting? After the thing with Vor, after that moment, I sort of forgot about it for a while. Until I got back to the perimeter and someone handed me something to sit on, and then I remembered and sat down very quickly." "I thought about that. What did it feel like, the moment itself?" He was quiet for a little while. Yusuf had the journalist's habit of not answering things until the answer was right. "You know how sometimes you're in a very loud place," he said finally, "and then suddenly the loudness stops and there's this ringing silence and your ears don't know what to do with it. It felt like that. Like something very loud had been happening that we'd all stopped noticing, and for a second it stopped and you could hear the quiet." He looked at his tea. "I don't know if that means anything," he said. "It means something," I said. Month 4. The formal negotiations were underway in Geneva, in a facility that the UEDC had constructed specifically for this purpose. Climate-controlled to Kethvaran comfort parameters, signal dampened, structurally reinforced, and surrounded by so many layers of security that the local birds apparently gave the whole district a wide berth for weeks before deciding it was probably fine. I was not in Geneva. I was in Karachi running signal networks that were now part of a global infrastructure upgrade that had been quietly proceeding since day 15 of the original crisis. One of the things humanity had noticed about itself during those 30 days was that our communication infrastructure was more fragile than it needed to be. We were fixing that. But I was receiving information. Rays sent periodic updates, not classified material, just the general shape of how things were going. And what she told me during month 4 was that the negotiations were going through their first real difficulty. Not a collapse, not a crisis. A specific impasse around a concept that the Kethvaran and humanity were genuinely unable to resolve because they were working from incompatible conceptual frameworks. The issue was, what happened when the Empire's needs and humanity's autonomy came into conflict? What was the framework for resolving disputes? The Empire operated on a model of hierarchical resolution. Disputes went up the chain to senior assessment and were decided from above. Humanity, even within the UEDC framework, which was itself a compromise, operated on negotiated consensus. Disputes were resolved through process, not through authority. These two models were not compatible. The impasse lasted 3 weeks. A lot of very smart people talked about it at length and didn't resolve it. Then a linguist on the xenolinguistics team, I don't know her name, she's never been publicly identified, noticed something in the Kethvaran language structure. A specific grammatical feature. In Kethvaran, the word for dispute had 2 forms, one used when both parties were within the hierarchy and one used for there was no clean translation for the second form. The closest approximation was something like, a conflict between parties whose hierarchy relationship is undefined. The Empire had a word for disputes between equals, hidden in their language, not used in 600 years of documentation as far as anyone could find. But there, which meant at some point in their history, probably far back enough that the Empire itself had no cultural memory of it, they had needed that word. The linguist brought this to the negotiation team. They brought it to Vor. They asked Vor what the process was for resolving disputes between equals. The response took 2 days. Senior assessment review, and when it came back, the answer was, to everyone's visible surprise, not a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement that the second form of the word existed, and a request for more time to research its historical context and associated protocols. 3 weeks later, from their own history, the Kethvaran produced a framework that had last been used more than 300 years ago, between 2 components of the Empire that had been briefly in unresolved status during a border administrative dispute. It wasn't perfect. It was old and incomplete and needed significant adaptation. But it was a place to start that both sides could recognize as legitimate because it came from inside the Empire's own language. Humanity hadn't asked them to accept something foreign. The answer had been in their language all along. That, the diplomatic historians later agreed, was the moment the negotiations became real. Before that, the Kethvaran had been engaging with humanity as a special case requiring managed resolution. After that, they were engaging with humanity as something the language already had a word for. Something that could be an equal. Month 7. The fleet in high orbit was still there. All through the negotiations, the ships hadn't moved, not threateningly, not in withdrawal. Just present. A reminder that the ceasefire was a choice they were making, not a permanent condition. I'd gotten used to seeing them when weather conditions made them visible. On clear nights, if you knew where to look, you could see the light of the 7 ships reflecting off the upper atmosphere. Like a second set of stars, not quite in the right places. Salma had come home to her apartment by then. She called me sometimes in the evenings, which she'd never done before the crisis. We talked about normal things, her daughters, children, the neighborhood, the way the city was slowly returning to its rhythms. We didn't usually talk about the negotiations or the fleet or any of it. One night she called and asked me directly, "Are they going to leave?" "Eventually," I said. "The negotiations are going well." "How well?" "Well enough." She was quiet for a moment. "You know what I realized," she said. "When they first came, when that message came on all the screens, I thought we're finished. I actually thought it. God forgive me, I thought. This is the end, we aren't strong enough for this." A lot of people thought that. But then I thought about my grandfather's saying, and then I thought, wait and see. She paused. "I've thought that my whole life, wait and see. Every terrible thing, wait and see. And it was never easy, and it was never pretty, and sometimes people got hurt who shouldn't have, but we waited, and we saw." "Yes," I said. "That's what we do," she said. "That's the human thing, we wait and we see and we don't stop." I didn't have anything better to say than that, so I didn't say anything. The Kethvaran did something in month 9 that nobody expected. They asked a question, not through VOR and the formal negotiations, directly in an open transmission to all of Earth's public broadcast systems. The way they'd transmitted the declaration 14 months earlier, same global reach, same formality. The question was, "Please describe what you call family." That was it, that was the entire transmission. "Please describe what you call family." The xenolinguistics team later established that the Kethvaran had a concept in their culture that was loosely analogous, a biological and social unit, but that the term they used for it was much more functionally defined. It was about resource allocation and biological reproduction and generational knowledge transfer. It was a practical category. Humanity's response was, I love this so much." Humanity's response was enormous and completely uncoordinated and entirely us. The UEDC didn't coordinate an official answer. There was no committee, no approved statement. Because the transmission had gone out publicly, the responses came back publicly, and they came from everywhere. Messages, videos, recordings, images, in every language, from every culture, from 8 billion people who'd been given a question that hit something genuinely fundamental. What is family? Billions of answers. Arguments, poetry, photographs of grandparents and siblings and children, and people who were family without sharing blood. Accounts of families that had broken and families that had held, and families that had been chosen rather than born into. Anger, sometimes, because family is not uncomplicated in any culture, in any life, and love, always underneath, even the complicated ones. The Kethvaran, monitoring all of it, spent 11 days processing before VOR transmitted back to the negotiation team. What VOR said was, the responses do not converge on a single definition. No, Vanderbilt confirmed. The concept appears to contain contradictions. Many contradictions, yes. And yet it is, from the responses, foundational to your species. Completely, Vanderbilt said. We build everything else on top of it. VOR was silent for a long moment. The ordered realm does not have a direct equivalent for a foundational concept that contains contradictions, VOR said. This is a notable difference. Do you find it a problem? We find it, VOR said, and there was a pause that the xenolinguists flagged as potentially significant. Genuinely without precedent. Genuinely without precedent. Not a problem, not a threat. not a manageable issue, something they had no prior experience of, something new. 600 years of expansion, and we'd given them something genuinely new. The ones who shouldn't work but do. Month 14. The recognition agreement was signed in Geneva on a Wednesday afternoon. I watched it on a screen in the relay station, with Akafar and Anwar and a room full of technicians who'd been part of the communication network. Reyes was in Geneva. She was part of the signing ceremony, representing the technical warfare division that had been central to the 30-day effort. The ceremony itself was short. The Kethvaran don't do ceremony the way we do, no flourish, no speech, no extended moment of human symbolic weight. Vor pressed a biological marker to the document. Vanderbilt signed. The documents were transmitted to the Empire's central authority for formal ratification. And then Vor did something that wasn't in the protocol. They looked at Vanderbilt, and they raised one upper limb. The same gesture, the exact mirror of what Yusuf Ademi had done in the Atacama Desert, 11 months earlier. Vanderbilt looked at it for a moment. Then she raised her hand back. Someone in the room, not me, I was watching on a screen from a relay station in Karachi, started crying. Then several people, then most of the room. Reyes told me later that she hadn't expected it. That moment. That she'd been holding herself together through the whole ceremony, every professional instinct engaged, and then Vor did that, and she felt something come loose in her chest and had to look at the ceiling. "It's just a gesture," I said. "That's why it worked," she said, "because it was just a gesture. Because they didn't have to do it, and it meant they understood something about gestures that they didn't understand 14 months ago." She was right. The empire of 400 systems, perfect in its logic and absolute in its protocol, had signed a document, and then offered a gesture that it had learned from a journalist with a broken leg in the Atacama Desert. That's something, that's genuinely something. I've been telling you this story for a while, and I want to be honest with you about something before I close. I'm not a hero of this, not even close. I maintained relay networks and I helped develop one disruption protocol among 17. The people who actually changed things, Vanderbilt, Reyes, Dr. Nwasu, Yusuf, Dr. Sato, the unnamed linguist who found the second form of the word for dispute, the 40,000 other people whose names aren't in any of the histories, those are the people who changed things. What I am is a witness. A man who was standing on a roof when the sky changed, who kept signals running while braver people did harder things, and who was paying attention when those things happened. I think witnessing matters. I think someone has to watch carefully and try to tell it true. Not clean, not inspiring, not with the rough parts edited out, but actually true. The fear and the chaos and the 30 days of everyone being terrified while also being stubborn. The negotiations with their 3-week impasse over incompatible frameworks for resolving disputes. Yusuf's broken leg, Salma's prayer beads. The thing I want you to take from this is not that humanity is invincible. We're not. We got lucky in ways that the historians mostly don't say out loud. If the Kethvaran had decided to simply strike rather than give us 30 days, it would have been different. Much different. The 30-day window was their protocol, their bureaucratic procedure, and it saved us more than anything we did ourselves. But what we did with those 30 days, that part was ours. The stubbornness and the creativity and the refusal to simplify under pressure. The decision to play music and go silent and route ghost signals, and find an old word buried in an alien language that even they had forgotten they had. The decision to sit in the same room with people we'd spent decades fighting and say, "Not right now, not this time, this one is together." That part was ours. The ones who shouldn't work but do. That's us, that's always been us. Every time, every terrible thing you wait and you see and you don't stop. And here we are. The observer ship at the edge of the solar system has been there for 3 years now. It transmits regularly, nothing dramatic, just routine observational data, which is what they said it was there for. Our analysts read everything they send. Sometimes they send things that feel almost like questions, phrased in the clipped formal language of their observation logs. Things like, "Human construction activity in orbital zone 4 appears to exceed previous year by 37%. Purpose, economic expansion or defensive preparation." Our official response to those entries is always, economic expansion. which is accurate. It's also not the whole story, but that's fine. The Kethveren are learning that about us, that we contain contradictions, that we don't converge on a single definition. We're teaching each other things, slowly, in the careful way that you teach when you remember how close the other thing was. I think that's enough. I think that's exactly enough. The fleet withdrew from high orbit 2 years after the signing. All 7 ships, in the same calm, unhurried way they'd arrived, pulled back through the upper atmosphere and were gone. I watched them go from my roof, the way I'd watched them come. The sky was clear that day, good light. I stayed up there for a long time after they were out of sight. Then I went inside and put the kettle on and went back to work. Here is the part of the story that the Kethveren's senior assessment never modeled. We taught them, not weapons, not technology, though that exchange came later and carefully in pieces, with a lot of negotiated conditions on both sides. What we taught them was smaller and stranger, and I think more lasting. We taught them how to fail. I need to back up to explain what I mean by that, because it sounds like a strange thing to be proud of. We taught them how to fail, but I've thought about this for years now, and I believe it's true, and I believe it matters. The Kethveren had never failed. 600 years, 37 incorporations, perfect record. And Dr. Nwasu had been exactly right that this was a vulnerability, not a tactical vulnerability, not something you could target with a weapon, but a deep structural brittleness in how they thought about problems. When something has never gone wrong, you stop building for the possibility that it will, not consciously. It just happens over time, over generations, over the accumulated weight of a 600-year record of nothing going wrong. The processes that would let you recognize failure when it arrived, acknowledge it, adjust, recover, those processes atrophy. They're not needed. They take up resources that could go elsewhere, so they go elsewhere. And then one day, something goes wrong. For the Kethveren, that day was our 30 days. Not in a catastrophic sense. They weren't destroyed or defeated or even significantly set back. In material terms, the 30 days cost them almost nothing. But in cognitive terms, in the terms of how they understood what was possible and what wasn't, what fit their models and what didn't, something fundamental had happened. For the first time in 600 years, reality had not matched their assessment. Their process had encountered something their process couldn't process. And they hadn't known what to do with that. Vore, in one of the later exchanges in Geneva, said something that Vanderbilt quoted in her memoir and that has been widely repeated since. Vore said, "The most significant outcome of this engagement is not the recognition agreement. The most significant outcome is that the ordered realm has encountered a situation where the outcomes were not predictable. This is new. The implications of this are being assessed." Vanderbilt had asked, "Do you find that frightening, the unpredictability?" Vore had considered it for a long time. "The ordered realm does not have a direct concept for the state you are describing," Vore said. "But if I were to construct an equivalent, I would say that the ordered realm finds it significant. More significant than the predictable outcomes that preceded it. More significant than the predictable outcomes. Because here is the thing about success, about a perfect, unbroken record of things going the way you planned. It is very comfortable. It is very reassuring, and it teaches you almost nothing. Failure, real failure, where the model breaks and you have to look at the pieces and figure out what they tell you about the model, is where understanding lives. Humanity had been failing at things and learning from those failures for 10,000 years. We'd failed at surviving famines and pandemics and ice ages and our own worst impulses. We'd failed at peace and built new frameworks for it. We'd failed at medicine and revised our understanding of bodies. We'd failed at governments and reinvented them. Badly sometimes, better sometimes, never perfectly, always again. We had a depth of experience with failure that 600 years of unbroken success couldn't touch. And that depth, that accumulated wisdom of things going wrong and continuing anyway, was what had let us do what we did in 30 days. Not the technology, which was inferior. Not the military power, which was vastly outmatched. The experience of surviving our own failures. When the Kethveren encountered something that didn't fit, they froze. They called for senior assessment. They slowed down. When we encountered something that didn't fit, an alien fleet above our skies, and a 30-day deadline to become someone else's managed problem, we didn't stop to wait for assessment. We got strange and creative and angry and stubborn, and we tried 17 different things, and some of them worked, and some of them didn't, and we didn't care because the trying was the point. That's what failure teaches you, how to keep trying. 3 years after the recognition agreement, the Empire requested something unusual. Vor transmitted the request through the formal communication channel, addressed to the UEDC Joint Council and the full diplomatic team. The request was for an educational exchange. Specifically, the Kethvaran wanted to send a delegation, a small one, 3 individuals, to observe human institutions for a period of 6 months. Not military installations, not technology facilities. Something different. What they asked to observe: hospitals, schools, and the operations of human emergency response services. The council debated it for 2 weeks. There were concerns, legitimate ones, about access and security and what the Kethvaran would do with what they learned. There were also people, and I will be honest, I was one of them in the small way I had any input, who felt that this request was precisely the right kind of thing to say yes to. Because what do hospitals, schools, and emergency services have in common? They are the places we built to manage failure. Hospitals exist because bodies fail and we don't give up on them. Schools exist because minds start knowing nothing and we don't give up on them. Emergency services exist because systems fail, fires, floods, accidents, and we don't give up on the people caught in those failures. The Kethvaran asking to observe those 3 specific things were asking, however indirectly, however much through the language of formal diplomatic request rather than open curiosity. They were asking to understand how we do that. How we build for failure, how we cope with it, how we keep going. The council said yes. The delegation arrived in 3 groups, staggered by 2 weeks each, because the full complement of 3 Kethvaran in the same location at once created what the security team described as a logistical confidence challenge. Vor was not among them. These were junior members of the Observer Corps, the Kethvaran's closest equivalent to researchers. The one I met was called Ethvar, shortened to Eth by the same practical human impulse that had produced Vor, and they were assigned to the Emergency Response Observation Program in our region. I was not a host, I wasn't part of the formal program. But Reyes, who was coordinating the program's technical component, knew that I'd been embedded in emergency response networks for my entire career and knew the work in a way that theoretical briefers didn't. She asked me to be available as an informal resource. So I met Eth at the relay station on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 years and 4 months after the fleet had first come through the atmosphere. They were shorter than Vor. Not all Kethvaran were the same size, I'd come to understand, and Eth was closer to 2 meters, which made them feel slightly less overwhelming in an interior space. They still had the same quality of attention, the wide-angled eyes taking in everything in that sideways predator gaze that I'd never entirely gotten comfortable with. But there was something different about Eth compared to Vor, something that I can only describe as younger, not naive, but less weighted by history, less shaped by 600 years of unbroken procedure. Eth looked around the relay station with what I recognized, after watching Kethvaran long enough, as genuine interest. "This is not a major facility," Eth said. "No," I said. "It's a node, part of a larger network, but this is where the work actually happens." "The larger facilities are not where the work happens." "The larger facilities are where the decisions are made," I said. "The work happens in places like this." Eth processed that. "You maintain the connectivity that allows decisions to be communicated." "When it breaks," I said, "decisions stop reaching people." "So yes, I maintain the connectivity." "And when it breaks, you repair it." "That's the job." Eth was quiet for a moment. In the ordered realm, failure of connectivity would trigger a report to assessment, and a repair protocol would be issued. "How long does that take?" "The assessment process is..." Eth paused. I got the feeling they were calculating something. "It varies, typically several cycles. During that time, affected communication channels would be inactive." "Several cycles, several days in local terms." "When our systems fail," I said, "we have about 30 minutes to restore them before lives start being lost, sometimes less." Eth looked at me with those wide sideways eyes. "Then your repair cannot wait for assessment," Eth said. "No, you have to just fix it. On the information you have, with the tools you have right now. And when you do not know the correct repair, you try things," I said. "You try the thing most likely to work. If it doesn't work, you try the next thing. You keep your hands on it and you don't stop until it's working. Eth was silent for a long enough time that I checked to make sure the translation unit was still active. In the ordered realm, Eth said finally, the process for situations where the correct approach is unknown is to escalate the situation to a level of authority with sufficient knowledge to determine the correct approach. And if you don't have time to escalate, the situation was not previously modeled. But it happens. Another pause. It does not often happen, Eth said. When the process is correctly followed, the need to act without sufficient knowledge does not typically arise. And when the process can't be followed correctly, Eth's gaze moved around the room and came back to me. This is what I am here to understand, they said. I spent 6 weeks working alongside Eth's observation program. Not officially, I was never an official part of it. But Reyes had arranged for me to be available, and Eth had developed a habit of seeking me out between the formal observation sessions, in the unstructured time that the program schedule left in the evenings. We talked, in the careful way that you talk across a significant language gap and a larger cultural gap, using the translation units and the shared vocabulary that the xenolinguistics teams had spent 14 months building. It wasn't a perfect medium for conversation, but it was enough. I showed Eth a flood response operation in week 3. Not a major one, a local flooding event, the kind of thing the regional emergency network handled regularly, small enough to be manageable and large enough to be real. We went together to the coordination center, and I stood in the back with Eth while the response team worked. Eth watched them for 4 hours and didn't ask a single question, just watched, the way I'd been told the Kethvaran watched, completely, storing everything, cataloging. Afterward outside, Eth said, the response coordinator made 17 decisions that conflicted with the initial plan. Yes, I said, conditions change. Each decision introduced new uncertainty into the operation. Yes, and yet the operation succeeded. Mostly, I said. We lost 2 vehicles we hadn't expected to lose, and the eastern sector took longer to clear than the plan allowed for. But no lives were lost. No lives were lost. Eth was quiet. In the ordered realm, they said, the response to 17 plan deviations would be a review of why the plan was insufficiently accurate, followed by a revised plan. We do that too, I said. Afterward, we do the review and we revise, but during you can't stop. You adapt. The coordinator was not distressed by the deviations. I thought about that. She's adapted a lot, I said. You get used to plans breaking. You learn to trust your ability to handle it when they break. The plan isn't the goal. The outcome is the goal. The plan is a tool rather than a structure. Yes, I said, exactly that. Eth looked at the city around us. The lights of the city coming on as evening came down, the sounds of people going about their lives, the distant call to prayer rising from a mosque 3 streets over. Your species plans extensively, Eth said. I have observed the planning, the documentation, the coordination infrastructure, the preparation. We do, I said. But you do not treat the plan as binding. We treat it as a best guess, I said. A best guess, Eth repeated. The translation unit rendered it in a flat register, but I'd learned to read something in the intervals around Eth's words that wasn't quite tone, but was something like it. Whatever that something was, it was active right now. Processing. The plan is the best guess about how things will go, I said. And then things go, and if they go the way you guessed, that's ideal. And if they don't, you adjust. And if the adjustment fails, you adjust again. And if that fails, you keep adjusting, I said, until you run out of things to try or until it works. Eth was quiet for a long moment, and when you run out of things to try. I thought about how to answer that honestly. Then sometimes you lose, I said. And then you sit with that for a while, and you figure out what you missed, and the next time you have more things to try. Eth looked at me. In those wide sideways eyes, something that I'd learned to read as close to what humans call reflection. This is why you were able to respond as you did, Eth said, during the declaration window. Partly, I said. Yeah, partly. The ordered realm has not lost, Eth said. Not in 600 years. We have a process that has not failed, and so we have not had occasion to develop, a search for a word, what you have just described. The practice of adjusting when things go wrong. Yes. It's not pleasant to have, I said. It comes from hard things. I understand, Eth said. Then, but it is useful. It's the most useful thing we have, I said. Eth's 6-month observation period ended on a Thursday in late autumn. The formal closing ceremony was brief. The Kethvaran remained non-ceremonial. But Rays had arranged a small gathering at the Regional Coordination Center with the people who'd been part of the hosting program. Food, because humans put food at everything, and conversation, and a general sense of something being completed that was hard to name precisely. Eth was there, composed and observational as always, but I'd spent enough time with them to read a slight difference in bearing. Something in the set of how they held their upper limbs, slightly more relaxed than their default. Not comfortable exactly, something closer. Before the gathering ended, Eth sought me out. They were carrying a data device that they held out toward me. I have prepared a notation, Eth said. For the observation record, a summary of what I have learned. What does it say? Eth considered. It says, the approximate translation is difficult, it says. The most significant characteristic of human emergency response is not efficiency. It is what you might call persistence without certainty. The capacity to act correctly or approximately correctly under conditions of complete uncertainty, and to continue acting until the situation is resolved or the actor is no longer capable. This characteristic is not present in any prior species interaction in the record. It appears to be foundational to how humans understand effective action. I looked at the device in Eth's hand and didn't take it, because it wasn't being offered to me, it was being shown to me. Shared. That's accurate, I said. It is difficult to understand from outside, Eth said. It requires a kind of the ordered realm word does not translate well. Something like acceptance that one's current understanding is incomplete, combined with willingness to act on incomplete understanding. We call it faith, I said. Sometimes, or trust, or just doing your job. Doing your job, Eth repeated. There was that quality again in the intervals around the words. Yeah, I said. Doing your job is knowing that things will go wrong and going anyway. And staying until it's done. Eth looked at me for a long moment, then they raised an upper limb. I raised my hand back. I will report what I have learned, Eth said. It will cause significant review within the senior assessment. I hope so, I said. Eth lowered their limb and turned to leave, then stopped, turned back. The one who raised his hand, Eth said. In the desert, the one from the initial meeting. Yusuf, I said. He as well. I thought about it. He's in Lagos, I said. Working, he went back to his work. He continued, Eth said. He continued, I confirmed. Eth considered this with the particular quality of attention that I'd come to recognize as their version of finding something significant. Good, they said. And then they left. I went back to the relay station that night. It was late by the time the gathering ended, and I should have gone home, but there was a routing check I'd been meaning to do all week, and it seemed like a good night to do it. The kind of night where you want to be doing something concrete with your hands. The station was quiet. Anwar had gotten into a habit of doing late checks too. We'd fallen into a rhythm in the years since the crisis, a comfortable professional shorthand. He was there when I arrived, running routine maintenance, and we worked in companionable quiet for a while. Ed left today, he said eventually. Yeah. Do you think it helped? He meant the observation program. Do you think they actually learned something? I thought about what Ed had said. About persistence without certainty. About acceptance that one's current understanding is incomplete. They learned something, I said. Whether it helps is a longer question. Do you think they'll come back? The fleet, I mean, one day. I sat with that for a moment. The honest answer was, I didn't know. The recognition agreement was holding, the exchanges were continuing, Vore and Vanderbilt were still in communication through the formal channels. But 400 systems and 600 years of expansion don't simply stop because one species complicated the model. The Empire was still out there. The assessment was still ongoing. The observer ship was still at the edge of the solar system. I don't know, I said. I think maybe the more important question is whether we'd be ready. Are we? More than we were, I said. Different than we were anyway. Anwar thought about that. He was 30 now, 3 years on from that strange young man who'd shown up with nowhere to be and become essential to something he hadn't expected to be part of. He'd finished his engineering degree. He was thinking about applying to the new UEDC Technical Exchange Program, which was beginning the slow work of sharing methodologies with the Kethvaran Observer Corps. "I've been thinking about something Eth said," he told me. "In one of the observation sessions, they asked me why humans name emergency protocols, not number them, name them. Operation Firewatch, Operation Clearwater, whatever. Why we give them names." "What did you tell them?" "I said it was so you could call it by name in the moment. So when things got bad, you could say we're running Firewatch, and everyone knew what that meant. A name is faster than a number, more human, easier to hold on to when you're panicking." "That's true." "But Eth said, and I keep thinking about this," Eth said, "the name suggests you believe the operation is a person, something with an identity rather than just a procedure." And I said, kind of without thinking, "Yeah, sort of, because we run it like a person. It has to adapt to what it encounters. Procedures don't adapt, people do." He was quiet for a moment. And Eth said, "We have procedures. We do not have people who are procedures." And I didn't know what to say to that, so I nodded, but I keep thinking about what it means. I did too after he said it. I kept thinking about it on the walk back from the station, in the quiet of the city at 2 in the morning. The particular quiet of a city that has come back to itself after something enormous, that has resumed its own rhythms, but carries the enormous thing in the background of everything, a changed thing wearing the face of something normal. People who are procedures. That's what we are in a way. We're trained, we're prepared, we follow plans, and when the plans break, which they always do, we are the thing that continues. Not the plan, us, the person. The variable, the unpredictable, the stubbornly continuing presence that looks at a broken plan and says, "Okay, but what do we do now?" The Kethvaran had procedures, perfect procedures, 600 years of refinement. And when the procedures encountered something that didn't fit, the procedures stopped, and then they called for assessment. We had procedures too, and when ours encountered something that didn't fit, we did something different. We asked each other, "What do we do now?" And then someone answered, not perfectly, not always correctly, but now immediately with what they had based on what they knew, and if it didn't work, someone else answered, and we kept going until it worked or we found the thing that would work eventually. That's the human procedure. The one that can't be written down because it's not a procedure, it's a posture. It's a way of standing in relation to uncertainty that says, "I don't know what comes next, and I'm going anyway." The Recognition Agreement's 5th anniversary was marked with a joint statement from the UEDC and the Kethvaran Observer Corps. Not a celebration, exactly, neither side did those in compatible ways, but an acknowledgement. A formal notation that 5 years had elapsed since the signing, and that the framework had held, and that the exchanges had produced value for both parties. The Kethvaran statement included a phrase that I read 3 times when the translation came through, because I wanted to make sure I had it right. It said, "The ordered realm has determined that the designation, manageable problem," applied to species humanity Sol III in the original assessment, is no longer operative. The revised designation, following 5 years of observation and exchange, is a species of significant and ongoing complexity whose assessment remains open and is expected to remain open indefinitely. Open indefinitely. We were the exception that caused new understanding. We were the ones who shouldn't work but do. We were the species whose assessment would remain open indefinitely because no model built in finite time could capture what we are. I want you to understand what that means to me personally. Not politically, not strategically. I'll leave that to people better positioned to analyze it. But personally, as a man who was standing on a roof when the sky changed, and who spent the years since keeping signals running and watching people braver and smarter than himself do hard things. Open indefinitely means they are still learning. 600 years of expansion. 37 species incorporated into clean completeness, assessed and categorized and managed, their complexity reduced to a protocol number. And then us. And then 30 days of chaos and music and silence and ghost signals and a journalist's broken leg and a linguist finding a word that had been lost for 3 centuries. And something in all of that was so interesting, so unexpectedly and fundamentally interesting, that the assessment remains open. Because we keep going, because we adapt. Because we're people who are procedures, and we name our operations, and we adjust 17 times, and we sit with the losses, and we come back for another round, and we somehow, against the odds, against the data, against every reasonable prediction, we keep surprising them. And ourselves. Salma called me the evening the 5th anniversary statement came out. She'd seen it on the news, the UEDC broadcast, and she called because she wanted to talk about it. We talked for an hour. About the 5 years, about her grandchildren, who had grown up with the fleet's presence as part of the sky they knew, who would never know a world where humans were alone in the universe and didn't know it. About what that would mean for them. "Do you think they'll be friends one day?" she asked. "Really friends, not just this formal exchange." I thought about Eth lowering their arm in a hotel conference room in a small autumn city. About Yusuf raising his hand in the desert. About the word for dispute between equals, buried for 300 years in an alien language, found by a human linguist who was paying attention. "I think," I said, "they're already something, maybe not friends yet, but something." "Something is a start," she said. "It's everything," I said. "It's always been everything." She was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way of someone who doesn't need to fill silences. "You know," she said, "when this is over, and I know it's not over, I know, but when it's really over, when all of this becomes just history that children study, do you know what I think they'll say was the most important thing?" "What?" "Not the ships, not the weapons or the signals or any of the clever things." She paused. "I think they'll say they kept talking. When they could have stopped talking, they kept talking. That's all. That's the whole story." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. The whole story. Maybe she's right. Maybe that's it, reduced to its essential form. We kept talking to each other when things were falling apart. To something alien and enormous and utterly unconcerned with us, until it became concerned, until we found the words it hadn't known it had, until we taught it something it hadn't known it needed. We kept talking, and here we are. Still here, still going. The assessment remains open. I still go up on the roof sometimes. Old habit. The water tower still doesn't work, hasn't worked in 11 years now. The city sounds like itself. The sky is the sky again. Sometimes I look toward Jupiter, toward the edge of the system where the observer ship keeps its quiet watch, and I think about what they're seeing when they look at us. 8 billion people, chaotic and contradictory and loud and creative and stubborn, going about the extraordinary, ordinary business of being human on a planet that's ours.